China has called for efforts to advance its strategic ties with Angola to a higher level. I sat down with the Angolan foreign minister to find out what it means for Angola. And I talked to Huang Hongxiang, a Chinese young man who is helping save African elephants with an unusual tool, communication. Welcome to a special edition of The Point from Beijing. I'm Lu Xin. This year marks the 35th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between China and Angola. China has called for efforts to advance its strategic partnership with the country to a higher level during the 2018 Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. As Angola is trying to diversify its economy from exports of natural resources and build up reconstruction efforts after a prolonged civil war, what does the FOCAC mean for Angola, and how will Sino-Angolan ties develop into the future? I sat down with Angola's Foreign Minister Manuel Augusto for his insights on the main goals of a strengthened partnership. Mr. Augusto, thank you very much for accepting our interview. Could you tell us your impression, your takeaway from the outcome of the summit so far? For instance, the 8-point action plan announced by President Xi Jinping at the opening ceremony.
I can say that the outcome of this Beijing summit met the expectations because on the preparation for this big and very important meeting, we were all expecting that President Xi Jinping would announce a new era, a new cycle on the Sino-African cooperation. And in fact, after these 3 days of meeting, our expectations were met. What I want to say is that China put the relations with Africa at a very high level, and is not only a strategic relationship, partnership, but will be, I'm sure, an element for the balance on the international relations. We are living now sometimes a little bit troubled due to many reasons, too many behaviors, too many strategies. And President Xi Jinping is shared with these African partners a vision of confidence in the future. No matter what's happened now, China is telling us that we must believe in the future, that Africa has a role to play in the future, provided that we be clear on the way we want to take. And he is helping his African partners to choose the right way. So that's why I say the 8 pillars he announced are all important and all interconnected.
As Foreign Minister, you must also pay very much attention to the kind of principles between China's diplomacy with Africa. And in the summit, in the speech, President Xi announced a 5-no approach, namely no interference in the choice of your development paths, no interference in your internal affairs, no imposition of China's will on its African counterparts, no attachment of political strings to assistance to Africa, and no seeking of selfish political gains. Does these principles address the aspirations of Angola?
Yes, that's what I meant when I say that the outcome met the expectations. In fact, these are some of the characteristics of the China relations with all our countries. Talking about Angola, that has been always the base of our partnership, of our bilateral relations. All these 5 no's, they are always present. And this good that President Xi Jinping highlighted for people who has doubt on what China seek when establish this special partnership. You know that there is many detractors of this China position in Africa. People want to talk about a new colonialism and things like that. And it was important that President Xi Jinping made it clear that what China is looking for has to do with everything except these 5 no's.
Well, let me ask you, since you mentioned new colonialism, Angola was the colony of Portugal for almost 100 years. What is the difference between China's behavior in Angola and the colonial?
So let me say that China has a big sense of the Portuguese colonialism before because of Macau, and so China knows what was not good on the colonialism. But speaking more seriously, there is no comparison. Colonialism is colonialism, partnership is a partnership. China is a young country, China, the modern China. Chinese culture, Chinese nation is an ancient millennia, but China is a new country. This China that we are dealing with came out in '49, so after the Second World War. And is this China that we know, that we trust, and has no comparison with any sort of colonialism or neo-colonialism.
During President Xi's meeting with your President Lorenzo just on Sunday, President Xi called for efforts to bring your strategic partnership to a higher level, and this year also marks the 35th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic ties. So how would you describe the current level of bilateral ties, and what are your future goals?
So let me say that I don't mind to repeat that our relations, the level of our relations are excellent. Especially the political and diplomatic ties. We have a convergence with China in most of the matters in the international relations, matters of common interest, especially those related with peace, security and stability in the world. We have a very close cooperation with China in many, if not all, issues of relevance in the international arena. As far as the bilateral relations are concerned, of course, we are now one of the first partners, if not the first, in Africa to China. And the participation of China in our economy is so wide that it's difficult to find a sector where China is not present. So, and China cooperation had an impact. When we talk about China cooperation with Angola, is not a rhetoric, because in the last 16 years, 17 years, was China who, along with the Angolans, drove us for the reconstruction, especially the reconstruction, the post-war reconstruction. When most of the world was giving their back to us, China was there, and they came along. And we can see that many things have been done, and we believe that in the near future, many more things will come. So when we met, when the President Lorenzo met President Xi Jinping, they really mentioned it. And the perspective for the futures are so high that the two heads of state, they decide to organize a state visit. So President Lorenzo very soon will come back to China in a state visit. That will be an occasion for more close discussions, and especially for the agreements that can foresee the relations between the two countries for the next decades.
Yeah. Well, you talk about the next decade. Belt and Road is a very long-term project. What are your country looking forward to in this initiative? Are there any current projects that's been undertaken?
In short, we can say that we are in on this belt and road. We are in fully, which means that we will try to take advantage of this new platform, and of course we will also bring our input on it, because this is a win-win cooperation that we are looking for. Angola has also many things that can bring in this new framework, and of course we expect that in the next 1-2 decades we can all be proud and happy with the results.
Yeah. Well, in the past, many African countries were getting loans from multinational banks or IMF, and now they were getting, but with those kind of loans, a lot of strings will be attached to structural reforms, for instance, whereas China give loans without any strings attached. Looking back to the Chinese loans, what have been the effects of this kind of loans to your country?
Yeah, the effects we can see in the projects that have been accomplished. China helped us to build thousands of kilometers of roads. They helped us to rehabilitate and reconstruct our railways. 3 railways lines have been rehabilitated by China. One of them is a transnational railways because links up to neighbor countries like Democratic Republic of Congo and Zambia. Is the way to link them to the Atlantic Ocean. So China helped us to build many cities, cities that are accommodating now millions of Angolans, especially the youth. China helped us to build hospitals, schools. China is in all areas. We have our new international airport, which will be inaugurated next year. China is the one who is helping us.
Well, what can Chinese companies offer or Chinese projects offer to Angola vis-a-vis other countries and other corporations? I mean, how do you evaluate China-Africa cooperation model compared to other models? Because you have American cooperation, you have cooperation with the EU and with Japan and ROK.
What I can say is that China is a very competitive country. And China in all areas, especially in the new, in the 4th industrial revolution, China is on the top also. So the new technologies, China has ownership, has the know-how, and can compete with any country in the world. China is going to the space, so China can do everything. And we expect China to compete in the different sectors. Our way of evaluating the models of a partnership is by the results. And so far, the results with China are very good.
Do you really mean it when you say China can do everything?
Yes, I mean it. You doubt?
I don't know. I'm asking you.
I mean it. Everything. I think that China now is, all domains, from the military to the industrial and the spatial. So
China needs partners as well.
Yes, of course, and we are there to contribute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Manuel.
It was a pleasure.
Hongxiang has been working to protect Africa's wildlife since graduation, a dream he's had since childhood. As an undercover ivory dealer, he came face to face with smugglers in Uganda. He and his team's efforts were included in the documentary The Ivory Game, which was released in November 2016 and shortlisted for Best Feature Documentary for the 2017 Oscars. In 2014, Huang Hongxiang launched China House, a platform for engaging Chinese communities in Africa on wildlife conservation and sustainable development. What inspired him to help save Africa's endangered wildlife, and what more can be done to combat the illegal ivory trade here in China and around the world? I talked to Huang Hongxiang, founder and CEO of China House, and I started by asking him how he felt when he found out that he got the undercover ivory dealer job because Chinese are among the largest consumers of ivory products.
Well, I would say when I first realized that, my thought was that, okay, so if China is part of the problem, it has to be part of the solution, right? So if Chinese people are part of the main global buyers of ivory trade, then Chinese people need to work a lot to stop ivory trade and to save elephants as well. And that's one of the biggest motivation actually for me to help those NGOs.
But help us understand the situation.
The director of the Ivory Game was...
Yeah, help us understand this question. Why are Chinese people so much into buying ivory? Because the Chinese government rolled out a comprehensive regulation, let's say, if not law, or law actually, that by the last day of 2017, China is going to stop all legal ivory trade and the banning of all ivory production. And yet this kind of law has, I must say, has achieved some effects. For instance, the total amount of ivory trade has decreased by half.
Yeah.
That's according to Traffic, a NGO, according to a report that they released at the end of last year.
Yeah, I think more than half.
More than half. And also the price, because of China's ivory ban, the price of ivory products also dropped dramatically. And yet, the perception seems to persist that Chinese people love ivory and they would do everything to smuggle ivory. What are the reasons behind that?
Well, I think there's one important thing to clarify, and that's what I always say to non-Chinese people, no matter in Africa or in the West. Although, on one hand, China may be one of the biggest ivory market in the world, it doesn't mean a lot of, most Chinese people buy ivory. And that's actually a big misunderstanding of non-Chinese people to the Chinese. In fact, based on my own experience, I would say the Chinese people who actually buy ivory would be less than 0.1% of China's population. However, because China is such a huge country, so even 0.1% of the population would be already a very big market. And then a lot of people will ask me this question, like, so why do you Chinese people buy ivory? And my answer is always the same. I never understand why some people buy diamond. So, to me personally, I feel like no matter some people buy ivory, some people buy diamonds, some people buy luxury bags. To me, they are almost the same. Because for some group of people,
but there's a difference there. There's a difference there, Hongxiang.
Really
for ivory, you have to kill elephants. For luxury bags that's made of leather, you probably don't have to kill endangered animals, not so much. This is the problem. Do the Chinese people understand the importance of protecting endangered wildlife?
So, because your question was asking me why they want to buy, and that's how I answer. I feel like when you are asking why do they want to buy, I think I feel like it's almost the same. However, as you rightfully pointed out, I think a lot of the time when Chinese people buy ivory, they do not know where ivory is from. For example, a lot of the Chinese people in China, they may think ivory, you can just get that off from an elephant and the elephants would still be fine. Or some Chinese people would hear the seller say, oh, our ivory are fine because they come from the naturally dead elephants, so it's totally fine. So a lot of the time I feel like lack of understanding of the real situation is one of the main reasons why Chinese people consume illegal wildlife products such as ivory. And that's why education and engagement to these communities, they are very important.
Yeah. So another thing you mentioned that when you go to a conference of wildlife protection or preservation, you would say everybody is talking about the problem created or associated with Chinese or Chinese conduct, but you don't see many Chinese participants to these kind of meetings. Why is that?
I think it's just because there's a over the past few years, no matter in Latin America or in Africa, I saw a huge gap between China and the world actually. For example, let's take ivory trade as an example. A lot of non-Chinese people will ask me, oh, do you all Chinese eat dogs? Do you all Chinese buy ivory? Which is definitely not true. At the same time, a lot of Chinese people will ask me, like, what is environmental NGO? What is NGO? And what is wildlife conservation? And also, like what's the situation about elephants? You will feel two sides know very little about each other, and there has been a lot of miscommunication before. So that's why when I said, in the past, in a lot of global conference, I see a lot of this kind of communication gap. And that's why over the past few years, compared with investigation, what I try to do more is trying to help a little bit with bridging that communication gap.
Yeah, how do you do that?
Well, so because of my personal experience in Latin America and Africa, I realized one thing. Because it may be very difficult for the older generation of Chinese people to understand what is international NGO and knowing how to talk to them. Not only because of the language, but also because of mindset, culture, and so on. But for young Chinese people, it's relatively different. Because on one hand, they understand the Chinese people, the Chinese culture. On the other hand, they're more open-minded, they speak relatively good English, and they can better understand how media work internationally and what are the NGOs. So what we are feeling is that if we can somehow bring more of this kind of young Chinese people to Africa and so on, they can somehow become a bridge. And that's what we were trying to do. Since 2014, I started China House. What we did is actually very simple. We brought a lot of young Chinese people to Africa, and then we did a lot of research and projects related to sustainable development of Chinese in Africa. For example, related to wildlife conservation, what we did is using these young Chinese people as a bridge, we communicate and partner with the local wildlife conservation organizations who are already organizing a lot of conservation activities, such as desnaring, taking off the snares set by the poachers to catch zebras and so on. And then we invite the Chinese communities in Africa to join us to do this kind of volunteering. It's not really about how many snares these Chinese volunteers can take off at one time. It's more about using this opportunity as a chance for the Chinese to understand better about wildlife conservation and to feel it emotionally. And then at the same time, the local people, a lot of them, they saw these Chinese, they interact with these Chinese people, and then they would say to me, wow, this is the first time I have actually talked to a Chinese person. And I didn't know Chinese people could be passionate about wildlife conservation as well. So that's the sort of things that we were trying to do.
Which points to a very interesting question. I mean, China and Africa, we are coming closer and closer, and from the part of the Chinese government, there's a great will, also from the business community, there's a great will to interact deeper with African country and African people. Where do you think where do you think the key lies for the people really to understand each other better, so that Chinese businesses and the African counterparts can really work in a sustainable, long-term, mutually beneficial manner?
I would say really the key is about communication. As you pointed out, I feel like over the past few years, we saw the Chinese communities in Africa, a lot of the time they want to do some charity, they want to do some good contribution to the local society. And actually regarding wildlife conservation, even Chinese embassy in Kenya and so on have donated quite a lot of material and vehicles and so on for locals. And Chinese communities in Africa, a lot of the time they do a lot of orphanage donation and so on to the local community as well. However, I agree with one of my American scholar friends that there's one thing that Chinese are not very good at, especially internationally, which is communication. A lot of the time you see this kind of material donation, you see this we helping building a road, a bridge and so on, but you rarely see the Chinese people are interacting with the local people in an in-depth way and having an open communication. And here I need to point out that some Chinese people would say one word, one sentence in Africa, saying that, oh, we have done so many good things, but the local people, they do not know what we are doing, they do not appreciate. It's because we haven't done enough propaganda. And I would say that is not a good idea to think about it. I would say what we need is not propaganda. What we need is communication. Propaganda is one way and communication is more mutual. It's about answering the doubts of the others. It's about asking the others questions. It's about having an equal and open conversation. And I think that would be the key for building this people-to-people exchange between Africa and China.
Very briefly, share with us 2 moments. Let's say the moment that you were most angry or helpless or frustrated, and the moment that you were the happiest in the past year, let's say.
Well, I would say one of the most frustrated moment is that, you know, like essentially what we China House are trying to do is just to create a bridge. That's very simple, right? Helping one side understand each other. But that is easier to be said than to be done. Because, for example, there was one time actually at the place of the ivory burning in Kenya, I met one American journalist. So she met me and she asked me questions about China and ivory and so on. And then I tried to answer, and I tried to say those things like, for example, not all Chinese buy ivory. And then she was like, how much money the Chinese government has to give you for propaganda? I was like, no, I didn't have that. So you feel that kind of like those kind of like feeling from some of the Westerners. And at the same time, sometimes we are going to meet some Chinese people who are saying to us that, well, like, you know, this issue of ivory trade is just a tool used by the Westerner to attack China. Why you as a Chinese, you are like a Chinese traitor? Why you are helping the Westerners attack China's image by admitting China is one of the biggest ivory buyers?
Do you have answers to these questions?
So if you ask me what's the most frustrating, well, what I would try to answer is that no matter we admit or we do not admit, that is something that the whole world believes. But after you admit there's a problem, and it's not a big deal like there's a problem. Every country has some problem. Every country has good people and bad people. So it's not a big deal.
Just have to do your job well.
Then you can tell people that not all Chinese buy ivory.
Time is very limited.
Yes.
What is
the most frustrating moment?
Yeah, what is the most hopeful, maybe happy moment in the past year for you?
Well, I would say then it's basically just the contrast, because we have witnessed a lot of moments of like how Chinese people can change and become wildlife conservation passionists. Because like we have seen so many Chinese people in Africa, and also sometimes young Chinese people from China, after participating in our activities, they would say to us that, oh, you know, Hong, like before, I have eaten pangolin before, I have bought ivory before, but that's because I didn't know the situation. Or even if I know you have to kill elephants to get ivory, I was never able to feel it emotionally. But after participating in your activities, now I feel it's totally wrong, and I would do my best to change that.
Okay.
And I will try to influence the people near me. I feel that's the happiest moment I feel over the past few years.
Thank you very much for sharing with us your thoughts and emotions. That was Huang Hongxiang, who founded and who is CEO of China House. And that is it for this edition of The Point with me, Li Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with Alex. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.